Dr. Humphries, if you want to come on up, if you'll just raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, so help
Thank
me
you.
God. Hello, my name is Dr. Suzanne Humphries. I am a board-certified internal medicine doctor and nephrologist, kidney doctor. I am also in the minority in that I have taken the past 8 years of my life to intensively study the history of vaccination, immunology, as well as the components of childhood vaccines and their effects upon the body and the available medical literature. I listened to the testimony that was from last week, and I'd like to address a couple of the issues. I'm not going to call myself an expert. I'm just going to say that I am an educated medical doctor with a board, with a medical license in the state of Virginia and the state of Maine, and I've taken on the issue because I witnessed my own patients falling ill, in many cases immediately after being vaccinated, oftentimes within 24 hours of being vaccinated in the hospital with no other explanation. So I can certainly attest that while the vaccine injury compensation program exists, that it would not encompass the kind of injuries that I witnessed. I was met with a huge wall of resistance among my peers who had absolutely no information at their fingertips, didn't know the contents of vaccines, didn't know the history of vaccination, didn't know the medical literature. I showed it to them, and I am the author of a book called Dissolving Illusions, Disease, Vaccines, and the Forgotten History that has over 800 references. Most of them are peer-reviewed medical references, and we go through the history of vaccination and dispel a lot of the mythology that I once also fell prey to. I used to berate my friends into vaccinating. I was that doctor. I was the doctor who used to guilt my patients into vaccines until I learned what I know now, and everything changed. And it changed to the degree that this is such an important issue for me that I've given up everything, a huge income, and I'm called a quack, and I'm denigrated by, if you go online, you will see, but it's baseless because I have the information and they don't. So what I would like to discuss, first off, is that I think there is a false sense of security among people who think that the current vaccination rates are providing herd immunity. There's a vast oversimplification in the thinking of medical doctors, as was demonstrated last week. And it is based on lack of information, and I'm not faulting them as individuals. It's a systemic problem. Medical doctors are not taught what's in vaccines. They are given the vaccine schedule, told they are safe and effective and save lives, as you heard over and over and over again, and as I have dispelled in Dissolving Illusions and many videos that I've put up on my YouTube page. So the problem is that if we want to just say vaccines are safe and effective and save lives, we can all just believe that in a religious fashion, or we can actually sit down and look at the information and dissect that. And that always takes a longer period of time to do. And that's why we're not going to see it done quite as often. So it's going to take me a little bit of time just to explain the measles situation to you, because California was brought up over and over again, and that is used as the demonstration for why we need to get herd immunity up to whatever level. 95% is was touted last week, but I can tell you that there's an article by Majumder who now says that we need 99% vaccination rates in order to achieve herd immunity. But I will tell you that even if we had 100% vaccination rates among every person in this room, every child in the state, that there would still be measles outbreaks if measles was brought in from another country or from someplace else. And that is because the vaccine has failed in its mission to eradicate the disease, let alone to eliminate the disease. So what we saw in California was very interesting. So we have to just go back a bit, because before this vaccine was brought onto the market, what we saw was the majority of children that were infected were between the ages of 3 and 15 years of age. Those children went on to have lifetime immunity while the virus was circulating in the community and basically giving boosters to everyone around. The most vulnerable people were those babies that were below 2 years of age. Those were protected by their mothers who had natural immunity to the actual disease, which is very well known in the peer-reviewed medical literature to give a longer and stronger provision of immunity to that vulnerable baby. So what we had after vaccination was that those babies are no longer protected. So now, as a result of vaccination, what we have are mothers who are vaccinated, and again, peer-reviewed medical literature, I'm happy to provide this for you, shows that those mothers at best are providing very limited immunity, perhaps 3 months, even while they're breastfeeding, and this comes from the placenta, during gestation. So these babies are now not protected directly because of vaccination. The older adults who were protected for a lifetime in the face of circulating viruses, again, they're not protected. And that was actually borne out in the California outbreak, where we saw that 11% of those cases were less than 1 year old in California, and that 56% were greater than 20 years old. Now, I'll tell you that the population that handles measles best are the children that we're targeting for vaccination. So we're absolutely targeting the wrong populations. I guarantee you that most people in this room, if you were to measure their immunity level, their titers, you would find that they're inadequate. And in fact, we know from LeBaron's article, which I'm happy to provide, peer-reviewed article, showing that after 20 years, 33% of us do not have protective antibodies to measles. So now we're told that those of us that are over 50 years of age need to start getting measles boosters. That's what we're looking at in the future. So that's the history, some of the history of measles. We're also told that it was all due to the unvaccinated in California. And I have the stats right here that I got from the CDC, MMWR, from California, the California Department of Public Health. This is available to everybody. And so there were approximately there were 49 unvaccinated people in that total of 110 cases in California. And I'll tell you that of them, 18 were old enough to have vaccination, but 12 of them were actually too young to be vaccinated. So it's not really fair to count them as unvaccinated. 9 of them were sick when the vaccine was due. Interestingly enough, there were 12% of those cases that were vaccinated. So that tells you that there was a large proportion of the outbreak in California that was vaccinated. And in fact, one of those cases turned out to be a vaccine strain. And when it was later tested because of increased surveillance, they took it off of the register and did not count it as a case anymore. And this has happened several times throughout the world where because of increased surveillance, they find that a case that they see with full-blown measles turns out to be a vaccine strain from the vaccine that child received, and they remove it from the register and don't count it as measles. So this is the kind of information that I encourage doctors to understand, and that there's a much bigger picture than that. So as a result of vaccination, what we have now, Damien in 1998, a peer-reviewed article showed that in twice vaccinated high school students, between 22 and 33% of those during a measles epidemic showed that they were not immune enough from the beginning, and that they had to have, that they basically showed a secondary immune response, meaning that the virus was replicating in their bodies and they were potentially contagious. There are Russian articles showing that hospitalized patients during epidemics, fully vaccinated people do not have sufficient titers to protect. So despite this high vaccination rate that we have today, we are not going to have herd immunity, and we will continue to have outbreaks. And because of this, there are scientists, Dr. Gregory Poland from the Mayo Clinic has written extensively on this problem, saying that we need a new vaccine, that this vaccine is failing, that we have problems with primary failure, meaning between 2 and 8% of twice vaccinated people never respond to the vaccine. We have secondary failure from the vaccine, which I talked to you about. Basically, the immunity degrades over time, and I'm susceptible according to this at this point. So we have a problem. We also have vaccine escape mutants, which nobody wants to talk about, but is in the medical literature. It's happening in China. There are mutant strains that are happening there. And so there was one other point I wanted to make with regard to primary failure, secondary vaccine failure. If I think of it, I will come back to it. There's one other issue I'd like to address, and that is that one of the physicians that testified last week said that there were people in the state of Virginia that were consulting the physicians here because they considered that West Virginia has a progressive vaccine policy. And I would like to update that physician on what happened in Virginia, because I was actually part of that. In Virginia, there was a bill that was proposed that asked for the religious exemption to be removed. The people spoke out, and 10 out of 10 of our senators rejected that bill outright. That was the result of the vote. The people spoke out, the senators listened, they listened to the evidence, despite the fact that there were people who had obvious conflicts of interest that were testifying and had the large majority of time and were actually skewing the statistics. We proved and showed how they were skewing the statistics, showing that there were more unvaccinated people in Virginia than there actually are. The states of Maine, Maryland, North Carolina, Washington, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island have all rejected legislation that would limit their vaccine exemptions. So please don't think that the 3 states that currently have these laws that only permit limited medical exemptions are progressive. They're not. They are the exception. I would like to address whooping cough, pertussis, because that was also brought up last week. And I happen to have studied this extensively, the history of the different vaccines, and I'd like to tell you about what's happening today. Whooping cough is endemic. I am called from people all over the world who tell me that their babies have whooping cough, that they've been to the doctor several times, the doctors couldn't recognize it, denied it, refused to test for it, and then finally, when the parents knew it was whooping cough, and they insisted on being tested, that those babies turned out to be positive. In the meantime, they were treated with drugs that not only will not be helpful, but that can be harmful. What's happening today, again, in the old days, before we had a different vaccine. Let me start to pre-vaccine. Pre-vaccine, adults developed very strong immunity at the lung interface, and I can get to that in a minute, but there's a peer-reviewed article by Warfel from 2014 that was done on baboons who show the similar type of cough and immunity to humans, which showed basically that if you don't have that strong immunity at the lung interface, that even if you're vaccinated, you're likely to be the person that's spreading disease asymptomatically. But pre-vaccine, these adults experienced the disease and they developed very strong immunity and limited the spread. Then the first vaccine came along. It was a whole cell vaccine, meaning it was the entire bacteria that was killed and put into the vaccine and injected. It had thimerosal in it and aluminum in it. It was very reactogenic. There were major problems that were happening with that. Vaccine companies went out of business. Connaught went out of business with that vaccine. And it was basically replaced by the vaccine that we have today, which is acellular vaccine, which means that there are just some parts of the bacteria in the vaccine. So the good news about that is that it's less reactogenic, meaning that there are far fewer problems with it, but there's still significant problems if you look at VAERS. But that it creates something called original antigenic sin. And I didn't create this term. This is an immunologic term that indicates that your first experience with an infection or with the vaccine will predict your response to later exposures. And that can actually be a detrimental thing or a helpful thing. If your first exposure is an acellular vaccine, this has been proven by Cherry, who is one of the foremost writers on this issue for the past 2 or 3 decades, peer-reviewed medical journals, showing that people that are vaccinated don't respond to a toxin that the bacteria creates called adenylate cyclase toxin. It basically creates a force field that fools the body. So what happens is these people get their vaccines, which might prevent you from coughing for a short period of time. But ask yourself, why do babies need so many vaccines? Why do we have to keep getting them over and over? Why does a pregnant woman require a vaccine every time she's pregnant, even if she's pregnant every year? It's because of this phenomenon that the vaccines, while they might prevent you from coughing for a short period of time, will not actually prevent you from spreading the disease. And moreover, that if you're exposed to the bacteria later, you are the person that's more at risk for having a very serious case of whooping cough if that vaccine is not protecting you the way it is designed to. The evidence for that is with Warfel that I talked about earlier, and also Dr. Cherry has written about this, that the people that are vaccinated, their immunity begins in the blood and not in the lung surface. The bacteria comes in through the lungs. And so you want the battle to take place at the lung surface, and that's what happens with natural immunity. So let me just tell you the difference between these two baboon types. They looked at baboons that had never been vaccinated, and they gave them the disease, whooping cough. Then they took some that were vaccinated with the vaccine that we use today, and they compared them after re-exposure. And what they found is that the baboons who had been vaccinated with the vaccine that we use today had very high colony counts of bacteria in their lungs, even though they weren't coughing when they were re-exposed. The baboons who actually were recovered after whooping cough and then re-exposed had no bacteria in their lungs. So that's one of the problems with today's vaccine. But the other problem is, and this is written about in the CDC's website, it's very widely published, nobody wants to talk about it, but mutant strains have been born out of vaccinated populations. Just like bacteria mutate and become superbugs, the same thing has happened in a big way with pertussis vaccines. It's a major problem. It's written about worldwide. There's pertactin, which is an antigen on the bacteria, is not on some of the bacteria that are now these mutant strains. They're producing more toxin. It's much more vicious. We're seeing definitely worse cases of whooping cough, and these strains, it's documented medical literature, have come out of vaccinated populations, not unvaccinated populations. They don't find them there.
Doctor, what we're going to have to do, we're out of time. We're actually about 15 minutes over, and I know we appreciate the information, and just to give this thing a fair shot at everything, I think I'm going to go ahead and lay this over to our next meeting. It'll probably be Tuesday, but I appreciate everybody coming out. It's just trying to get everybody in with their voices, and so we can all be heard on this to make a fair decision. Okay. Chair recognizes the senator from Jefferson to wrap up with the questions, and then we'll go from there real quick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. I know we don't have much time, so I'm just going to ask you about a couple things. I very much appreciate you coming and the excellent information that you have. I would love to get some of this stuff emailed to me, and I will check your YouTube channel too. Thank you. So I have here the states, the 47 states that have religious exemptions. And in your extensive studies that you have done, have you seen that by granting religious exemptions, it has caused any kind of detrimental effect in those states?
Certainly not, and definitely not in the state of Virginia. The fact is that even people who want to be exempt from some vaccines will still be in favor of getting medical treatment. It's actually, there was one case in Philadelphia that rejected that, but that's certainly not the norm.
Okay, thank you very much. And then one more question. So I agreed with you in the presentations that we heard last Tuesday. I do not wish for anyone to get sick or get hurt by vaccines. But in your testimony, you make it sound like some of the vaccines might actually be causing more illness than if we weren't vaccinated. Is that what you're trying to say, at least in some cases?
Well, I have to look at each vaccine separately. I'm not going to... It depends on what you're calling an illness, because vaccines can literally affect any organ of the body. There's a risk and a benefit ratio for every vaccine. Herd immunity is not a given for every vaccine. Some of them, it's not even built into the blueprint of the vaccine itself. So we have to look at each vaccine separately. When it comes to whooping cough, I think when you look at the total picture and see that the mutant strains have evolved in vaccinated populations, that's a vaccine that needs to be critically looked at, and parents and doctors need to be informed about the problems. We can't just keep religiously repeating vaccines are safe, effective, and necessary while people are getting very sick and not getting compensated for the lives that are lost.
So you would be in favor of just a more informed consent of the population?
And I am in favor of people being able to opt out of certain vaccines if it's against their moral and religious preference, and that doctors need to be able to make their own decisions for medical exemptions. Even in your state, that's getting funneled through one young doctor who doesn't have very much experience. That's basically telling every other doctor that's 40, 50 years old that their medical opinion doesn't matter.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. If it's okay with you all, I'm going to go ahead, and if there's no other business for the time being, I know there's still more questions. We'll continue this and lay it over. I'm going to call on the senator from Upshur.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Motion on the floor to adjourn. All in favor say aye. All opposed say
Aye.
no. We all